Tucked deep into the Smoky Mountain foothills, past Greene County's forgotten ridgelines and shrouded roads, sits a stretch of fenced acreage once known by locals only as the Farm. From 1946 to 1974, it was operated as a spiritual retreat and communal labor settlement by the privately chartered Elijah Mission Fellowship. No newspapers covered its opening, no government official publicly endorsed it. Yet over the course of nearly 3 decades, at least 327 individuals were known to have entered the property. None were officially recorded as having left. The Elijah Mission Fellowship presented itself as a self-sufficient Christian agrarian collective dedicated to spiritual renewal through work, humility, and isolation. Promotional pamphlets distributed to small-town churches throughout the South described a safe haven from sin, urban decay, and moral confusion. Their message resonated deeply in the post-war South, particularly among families broken by the Depression, veterans returning from the Pacific, and widows displaced by industrial expansion. The community promised food security, moral clarity, and divine fellowship. Its founder, Reverend Earl R. Tolliver, claimed in radio sermons that Elijah Mission was not a cult but a cure. Yet by the time the state of Tennessee took legal action in 1974, the farm's gates had been locked for years, its buildings crumbling, and its residents, hundreds of them, missing without a trace. Reverend Earl R. Tolliver did not begin his ministry as a radical. Born in Chattanooga in 1901 to a Methodist machinist and a factory laundress, he studied scripture not in seminaries, but in state libraries and storefront missions. By the early 1930s, he was holding revival meetings in rented tents across southern Tennessee. He was not charismatic in the traditional sense. He stammered, perspired heavily, and rarely made eye contact. But his sermons were gripping, filled with apocalyptic urgency and rural pragmatism. He spoke of the corrosion of cities, the false lights of science, and the devil's arithmetic of money. It was in 1945, following a brief disappearance from the public eye, that Tolliver re-emerged with a plan. He had acquired, through a combination of donations and shell land trusts, nearly 200 acres of untouched forest land near the Unaka Range. This land, he proclaimed in sermons broadcast from a low-wattage AM station in Morristown, would become a sanctuary for those willing to renounce the outside world. His message arrived at an opportune time. Soldiers were returning from Europe and Asia, many to poverty and fragmented families. Churches were losing members to suburban migration and televised distractions, and a deep undercurrent of Cold War dread was taking root. By early 1946, the first wave of settlers had arrived. These were not fringe extremists. Many were older couples, farmers from the Carolinas, war widows, and out-of-work machinists. The Elijah Mission Fellowship offered them land to till, shared housing, and 3 communal meals a day. All personal possessions were to be surrendered upon arrival. Letters were permitted only once per quarter and censored for spiritual contamination. Departures required a formal petition, which could take months to process. Most never filed one. The state initially viewed the fellowship as a benign curiosity. It operated under a religious tax exemption, filed annual reports listing agricultural outputs, and maintained a facade of legitimacy through intermittent contact with the Greene County Register's office. However, the first signs of bureaucratic unease appeared in 1952, when a public school teacher from Limestone reported that several siblings had been withdrawn and relocated to the fellowship, allegedly to be homeschooled. When a county welfare officer attempted a site visit, she was turned away at the gate by armed men claiming to be pastoral protectors. Despite this, media attention remained absent. The Elijah Mission operated far from major roads, and its members rarely ventured out. The few who did speak publicly, mostly elderly women attending funerals or regional produce fairs, described the community as disciplined but loving, honest work under God, and free from temptations. Photographs taken in the early years show smiling families beside cornfields and a modest white chapel. There were no fences visible in those images. That would change by 1957. In that year, local surveyors working on a forest demarcation project reported encountering electrified fencing and watchtowers near the fellowship's perimeter. When asked, Reverend Tolliver claimed these were deterrents against wolves, both four-legged and otherwise. The county did not pursue the matter. Greene County was struggling with underfunding, population decline, and deep divisions between secular authorities and rural congregations. To many officials, the fellowship was a problem best left alone. By 1961, internal leadership within the fellowship had grown more opaque. Tolliver appointed a council of 12 to manage daily operations. Each member lived in a separate cabin and was referred to only by a biblical pseudonym. According to a rare testimony from a former member who escaped in 1968, a testimony later sealed by court order, the council determined meal rations, administered punishment, and reviewed all correspondence. Infractions included external desire, doubt in stewardship, and unlawful curiosity. Punishments ranged from temporary labor bans to silence confinement, an isolation chamber located beneath the chapel. The fellowship's agricultural production peaked in 1963, when it reported over 38 tons of canned produce and 4,000 pounds of grain sent to partner communities across Georgia and Alabama. However, no records indicate receipt of these goods. The supposed partner communities were not traceable through business licenses or church affiliations. The fellowship's growing economic self-sufficiency further distanced it from regulatory oversight. Still, whispers began to surface. In Knoxville, a young woman named Brenda Wiles filed a missing persons report for her brother Michael, who had joined the fellowship in 1959 and ceased all contact by 1962. Brenda's attempts to visit the property were met with silence. When she contacted the county sheriff, he discouraged further inquiries, citing religious freedoms and sovereign property rights. Brenda's file would eventually be marked closed, person unreachable, not presumed deceased. From 1965 to 1969, 12 more families across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina attempted to report missing relatives believed to have joined the Elijah Mission. In every case, the report stalled at the county level. No federal agency took jurisdiction. The fellowship, through carefully prepared paperwork, argued that all entrants were volunteers in permanent covenant, and thus not missing, but spiritually relocated. This was the legal cornerstone upon which the institution's reputation stood. To the outside world, it was a harsh but voluntary religious colony. To those within, it was something else entirely. In 1970, a Greenville circuit judge quietly approved a motion to shield the Elijah Mission Fellowship from what it termed undue civic interference, citing the group's religious designation and lack of criminal complaints. The motion, submitted by a private attorney from Nashville with ties to several rural preservationist groups, effectively blocked county officials from performing surprise inspections. It also granted the fellowship exemption from most zoning and educational oversight. The ruling barely made mention in local newspapers, and no reporter from the Knoxville or Johnson City bureaus followed up. Yet behind that curtain of legality, the fellowship's internal structure hardened into something far less benign. The original communal barracks had by then been subdivided into rank-based quarters, with younger laborers moved into dirt-floored sheds along the lower pasture, and older residents relocated to dormitories closer to the chapel. Children were separated from parents by the age of 6 and rotated between 3 spiritual instruction centers, each overseen by council-appointed educators with no formal training. An account taken from a debriefing in 1975, part of a sealed Department of Health and Human Services inquiry, described one such instruction center. It was a converted livestock barn, partitioned into 6 rooms by salvaged barnwood. Children slept 3 to a mattress, rising at 5 in the morning for scripture recitation and movement drills, a term left undefined in the document. Meals consisted mostly of beans, cornbread, and rehydrated root vegetables. Physical discipline was administered publicly. Infractions included hesitation, murmuring, or failure to recite verses from memory. The teaching staff, according to this testimony, spoke rarely and made no eye contact. Their clothing bore no personal markings. Their names were replaced with biblical terms such as obedience and humility. On rare occasions, outsiders who had joined the fellowship as late as the mid-60s described hearing strange whistles or bells from the instruction barns after nightfall, but no visitor was ever permitted inside. Public interaction with the fellowship had by then narrowed to a single channel, a monthly delivery route operated by a man named Curtis DeWitt, a former postal driver contracted under a religious exemption to bring and retrieve mailbags from the property's southern access road. DeWitt's logs were irregular. He reported fewer and fewer outgoing letters each year and noted that most incoming mail was returned unclaimed. When questioned by a state investigator in 1971, DeWitt expressed mild concern about the property's growing silence, but claimed that everything looked peaceful from the edge. He was never asked to step beyond the gate. By this point, the original church networks that had once funneled new members into the fellowship had largely gone quiet. Smaller congregations that had previously supported Reverend Tolliver's sermons reported fewer communications, and eventually, none at all. A few pastors expressed unease, particularly after a string of unpaid debts and broken land contracts came to light in Alabama and South Carolina. One former church elder who spoke with state auditors claimed he had once recommended the fellowship to 3 widows, none of whom had been seen since 1964. Yet even amid this isolation, the Elijah Mission maintained a veneer of function. Annual agricultural filings listed corn, potatoes, and okra, yields far exceeding average output for the region. Yet aerial photos taken by the Tennessee Department of Conservation in 1972, part of a soil erosion survey, showed vast sections of the land lying fallow. When officials questioned the discrepancy, the fellowship responded with a dense package of handwritten ledgers, obscure harvest terminology, and notarized affidavits signed only with first names. The state accepted the documents. Internal maps, recovered years later during legal proceedings, revealed that the fellowship had expanded well beyond its initial 200 acres. A network of footpaths, tool sheds, food silos, and isolation cells were distributed across an irregular perimeter fenced with salvaged rail track. The maps bore no dates. Structures were listed not by function, but by code. Repose, longing, redemption. The largest structure, simply labeled Judgment, occupied the center of the property and had no access road. When the Department of Agriculture requested a site visit in late 1973, citing suspected misuse of crop subsidies, a letter from the fellowship's legal representative denied the request, invoking the 1970 judicial ruling. A counter-motion to compel entry was filed, but delayed repeatedly due to clerical errors and missing court staff. By the time the paperwork reached a judge in early 1974, news of the fellowship's closure had already begun to leak. Closure was perhaps the wrong word. In March of that year, a Greene County deputy responding to an unrelated trespassing complaint near the fellowship's western boundary reported finding 2 young boys near the tree line. They were malnourished, barefoot, and unable to articulate their names. They wore identical coarse garments and carried a leather pouch filled with dry corn and a handwritten verse from the Book of Ezekiel. When questioned, they referenced Mother Ruth and the upper silence. The deputy called for medical transport. Before sunrise, the fellowship's main gate was found locked from the inside. What followed was not a raid, nor a criminal investigation. It was a bureaucratic delay, a series of jurisdictional ambiguities stretching over 6 weeks. County records show that the property was visited 3 times between April and May 1974 by state officials, each time from different departments: public health, child welfare, and agricultural oversight. In all 3 instances, entry was denied or evaded. No warrant was ever successfully served. Finally, in June 1974, a backhoe team contracted to clear a firebreak near the southern perimeter reported signs of abandonment. Power lines were severed. Livestock pens were empty. Trash pits overflowed. Most buildings appeared intact, but showed signs of hasty desertion. Inside the chapel they found a burned ledger, a broken pew, and a chain affixed to a steel ring embedded in the floor. The team left without further inspection. By July, the state assembled a formal task force, the Interagency Review Committee on Isolated Religious Compounds, with the intent to audit, photograph, and secure the property. But when they arrived, accompanied by a small law enforcement escort, the land had been stripped, beds were gone, food stores empty, Bibles torn, floors bleached. No human being, living or dead, was found. Yet a roll call chart discovered in the instructional barn listed 327 names, none of whom appeared in state employment, school, or census records after 1970. What remained was silence. Neighbors kept their distance. The county filed no charges. Reverend Earl R. Tolliver was never located. His last known signature appeared on a bank withdrawal form in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, dated March 1974. Beyond that, no trace. The Fellowship's incorporation was dissolved quietly in 1975, and its land parcels redistributed by auction. Not a single family of the missing was ever compensated. The Elijah Mission Fellowship had not failed in the traditional sense. It had simply disappeared. In the years preceding the final abandonment of the Elijah Mission Fellowship, there were warnings. They came quietly, sometimes muttered in bus terminals, sometimes written in smudged handwriting on the back of gas station receipts, and sometimes spoken through closed teeth by people who had been inside but refused to say how they got out. These signals never coalesced into formal reports. They flickered briefly, only to be buried under jurisdictional confusion or dismissed as hearsay from disgruntled apostates. But the pattern was there for anyone willing to trace it. One such warning surfaced in 1966 when a transient named Eileen Madsen arrived at a roadside diner near Bean Station with blood on her skirt and a laminated scripture verse tied around her neck with baling twine. She claimed she had escaped a farm for believers after being denied food for 3 days. The sheriff's deputy who questioned her described her as hysterical but coherent. She named 3 people still inside the compound, one of whom matched a missing persons report filed 3 years earlier in Abingdon, Virginia. Her account was recorded on tape, but later misplaced in a departmental reorganization. Madsen herself was admitted to a Knoxville psychiatric ward and discharged 5 months later to an address that did not exist. No follow-up was conducted. There were also letters. In 1968, the post office in Morristown flagged a set of envelopes bearing no return address, each marked with the same smeared fingerprint on the flap. The letters, addressed to churches across eastern Tennessee, contained a cryptic plea. He keeps them underground when the sky is sick. The red cloth marks the sick days. They aren't dead. Not all of them. The sheriff's department dismissed the letters as a prank. The churches, most of them rural Pentecostal congregations, quietly destroyed them. Only one pastor, James Loden of Granger County, attempted to investigate further. He drove to the property in early spring and was met by 2 armed men who instructed him to leave. He returned once more a year later. His car was found idling on a logging road, doors open, Bible still on the passenger seat. Loden was never seen again. State agencies too had their chance. In 1971, the Tennessee Department of Labor opened a preliminary review into suspected wage violations involving volunteer laborers. One former member, whose name was redacted in agency records, had filed an anonymous complaint from a motel in Asheville. He described being forced to clear rocks and till fields for 16 hours a day under threat of sleep deprivation. When pressed for proof of employment, the fellowship submitted documents indicating that all members were bound by sacred agreement, not compensated labor. The complaint was shelved. The failure to act was not always rooted in malice or corruption. More often, it was a failure of clarity. The Elijah Mission Fellowship did not register as a business, nor did it fall neatly within the bounds of religious exemption law. It was a moving target, part ministry, part commune, part correctional system. Without victims willing to speak publicly and without a clear statute being violated, investigators found themselves circling a void. And into that void, the whispers continued. One of the most telling indicators came from Greenville's General Hospital, whose patient log from July 1969 includes an entry for J. Miller, male, estimated age 9. The child had been found wandering near the Nolichucky River, sunburned and dehydrated, with ligature marks on both ankles. He spoke only in fragments, often repeating the phrase, "number was taken." Staff noted his avoidance of eye contact and refusal to eat solid food. Attempts to place him into the foster system failed when no guardian or next of kin could be located. After 3 weeks, he was transferred to a Knoxville group home. A fire destroyed that home the following year. No records of J. Miller remain beyond that initial hospital admission. Within the fellowship, warning signs appeared even in the most mundane records. A 1964 soil assessment conducted by a regional agricultural cooperative noted abnormal subsidence in 2 lower fields. When a technician returned to collect samples, he was told those areas were now devoted to spiritual meditation and off-limits to outsiders. When pressed, the fellowship offered alternative land parcels for assessment and provided soil samples already packaged in mason jars. The technician, under deadline, and with no clear authority to force entry, accepted them. Medical records, though rare, told their own story. In the entire span from 1955 to 1974, only 7 residents of the Elijah Mission Fellowship were ever recorded as having received hospital care in Greene County. Of those 7, 5 were over the age of 70 and listed their occupation as prayer cultivator. 2 were children. 1, a girl identified only as Marion, was brought in for a severe abdominal injury described as possible rupture due to pressure trauma. Her guardian claimed she had fallen from a storage shelf while cleaning. The physician noted inconsistencies in the bruising pattern but filed no formal report. Marion was never brought in again. By the late 1960s, even mail carriers grew uneasy. Curtis DeWitt, who had handled the route for over a decade, told a regional logistics officer in 1972 that the property had become more like a prison than a farm. He reported increasingly long waits at the gate, diminishing communication, and an overall sense that he was being watched. Once, he returned to his truck to find the windshield wipers missing. On another visit, he found a photograph of his daughter tucked into the outgoing mail pouch. When he submitted his resignation, he left the following note: "They know when I'm coming now. They don't need mail." Within the broader community, mention of the fellowship became a kind of taboo. Former members, if they existed outside, did not identify themselves. Church leaders who had once praised Reverend Tolliver fell silent or deflected when questioned. A farmer who owned land adjacent to the western border recalled seeing unusual bonfires at irregular intervals. No smoke, just light, like a furnace had cracked open. A traveling seed salesman claimed he was told by an armed resident to leave before the cleansing horn blew. His report to the sheriff's office was never filed. Even public works crews began to avoid the area. Greene County's road maintenance logs show that from 1967 onward, all bridge and culvert inspections within 1 mile of the fellowship property were either cancelled or reassigned. One former road surveyor later stated in a deposition that he was instructed unofficially not to work near the eastern access road after dusk. When asked why, he shrugged. Just wasn't a place you lingered. Inside the institution, those who began to question the fellowship's practices found no safe process for raising concerns. According to sealed testimony obtained during a post-closure review, any member who asked to leave was subjected to a period of preparation silence, during which they were confined to a small wooden room with no bedding, forced to recite confessionals written by council members, and denied all contact with others. After this period, the individual was either allowed to depart, often with no possessions and no funds, or reassigned to remote labor without explanation. Those who returned after leaving, rare but documented, often did so without clear reason. One such case involved a man known only as Isaac, who reportedly left in 1965 after spiritual failure, then reappeared on the property 2 years later, blind in one eye and missing 2 fingers. His re-entry was celebrated with a community fast. No record of his time away was ever produced. The council called his return a harvest of the prodigal. Within weeks, he was appointed to oversee Redemption, the building without access roads. The cumulative effect of these ignored signs was not a single explosive revelation, but a gradual deepening of unease. 100 small omissions. 100 flickers of something wrong, just beneath the surface. By the time the last gate was locked and the last name crossed off the ledger, the truth had already been visible to anyone willing to see. In late 1972, a man named Luther Ray appeared at the Greene County Courthouse with a water-stained binder and a tremor he could not control. He claimed to have spent over 6 years inside the Elijah Mission Fellowship and wanted to report ritualized labor violations and group punishments of unrecorded persons. The clerk on duty, unfamiliar with the name, directed him to the Department of Agriculture, assuming he was a disgruntled farmhand. Ray was told to fill out a form and await correspondence. He left the building carrying the binder under one arm. No one at the courthouse saw him again. 3 months later, the same binder surfaced in the possession of a local journalist, Patrick Lantham, who had covered school board disputes and livestock auctions for the Greenville Gazette. It was delivered without a return address, wrapped in butcher paper and marked only with the word obligation. Inside were 138 pages of handwritten notes, diagrams of living quarters, and detailed entries on rationing schedules, punishment rotations, and abandonment units. The writing shifted between block capitals and cursive, as though compiled by more than one person. Lanham attempted to verify the document's contents. He contacted local churches, county archivists, and even the Postal Service to confirm the names listed in the binder's rosters. Most inquiries yielded nothing. A few drew quiet hang-ups. One mail clerk in Limestone told him, "You ask about those names too often. Someone's going to come ask about you." Lanham published a single column referring obliquely to the Elijah Mission, citing, "concerning patterns of isolation and spiritual coercion in our region." Within a week, his office was burgled. Nothing of value was taken, except the binder. What Lanham did preserve, and later sent to a colleague in Chattanooga, was a photocopy of one section titled Last Threshold. It described a structure beneath the chapel, reachable only through a trapdoor hidden behind the pulpit. The notes referred to a stairwell carved from stone and a crawl beyond absolution where members deemed spiritually damaged were placed until their impurities softened. The section listed 4 initials, each followed by the word returned or not. Years later, when the chapel was inspected during the brief state review of 1974, no stairwell was visible. The pulpit had been removed. The floor showed signs of recent resurfacing, though the rest of the structure was in decay. Investigators at the time noted the presence of discolored floorboards and remnants of a rusted latch. A photograph, filed but never publicly released, showed what appeared to be a concrete cap in the corner of the foundation. Its surface was smooth, but marred by deep scratches in repeating arcs. This pattern of near misses recurred throughout the fellowship's decline. Each warning was either too vague, too late, or deliberately stifled. In 1973, a family of 6 approached a local attorney, hoping to file a petition for the return of their eldest son, who had joined the fellowship at 19 and ceased contact 2 years later. The attorney began preparing a civil case, but was disbarred weeks later for unrelated financial misconduct. The family's petition never reached court. That same year, 2 volunteers from the Appalachian Literacy Initiative claimed they were invited by letter to conduct reading workshops for children on the property. Upon arrival, they were denied entry and held at a perimeter shack for 6 hours, during which they were questioned separately about their affiliations, their reading materials, and their opinions on Scripture. When finally released, they were each handed a bag of produce and a tract titled The Breathless Harvest. Neither volunteer filed a report. When contacted decades later, one stated flatly, "They didn't need us to teach anything. They wanted to see what we'd say no to." It was this testing of boundaries, this careful mapping of outside tolerance, that defined the fellowship's approach to oversight. By the early 70s, their internal protocols mirrored bureaucratic logic with unsettling precision. Each member was assigned a number. Daily tasks were logged in ledgers, kept in a windowless room labeled balance. Requests to leave were processed through a 5-stage hierarchy, beginning with confession and ending with a review by the council's 3 most senior members, known colloquially as the custodians. Few such requests were granted. The outside world, in contrast, was not forbidden but irrelevant. Radios were disassembled, newspapers repurposed as insulation. A barn in the northern section contained a wall of clipped headlines from the early 50s, arranged into strange collages, their meanings obscured. One configuration read, "No milk since rain, flood delays county board, hand crushed in press, debts forgiven, 16 not found." When state inspectors entered that barn in 1974, the collages were gone. Only the tax remained. As the fellowship's isolation deepened, its rituals became harder to pass. Survivors, few as they were, spoke of calendrical fasts aligned with lunar phases, labor cycles punctuated by complete silence, and moments of communal stillness enforced without warning. One former member described a practice called passing through hush, wherein selected individuals were required to walk blindfolded between rows of motionless congregants, reciting pre-assigned phrases. Mistakes resulted in removal from group duties and a term of beneath supplication, a phrase never defined in any legal record. But the most disturbing accounts emerged from the few children who left. One girl, adopted under sealed circumstances by a family in Johnson City, began drawing pictures at age 6 of windowless rooms, people without mouths, and ropes suspended from beams without context. When asked what they meant, she whispered, "Those were the ones who couldn't speak right, they got put in." Another survivor, an adolescent boy placed into state care in 1975, spoke of the lowering, a monthly event involving the ringing of an unseen bell and the removal of selected individuals from the sleeping quarters. He described how blankets were taken, names were called. Those chosen were led toward the chapel and did not return by morning. When asked who took them, the boy replied, "The ones with no numbers." Despite this, no charges were ever filed, no mass grave discovered. The land, once confiscated, yielded no bodies, no remains, no clear violation of law that could be pursued. The silence was absolute. In the words of one state review board member, "They vanished within the law. We had no structure to hold them. What lingered were fragments, testimonies recorded on cassettes that warped in humidity, ledger pages with ink washed out by bleach, a photograph of children lined up before a barn, all facing away from the camera, names etched into the underside of a workbench, barely legible beneath layers of whitewash, an unfinished song found in the chapel's piano bench, composed of 4 notes and lyrics that read, 'Let them bury, let them bloom, silence feeds the living room.' The horror of Elijah Mission was not just in what it did, but in how easily it was permitted to do it. How often the signs were there, how clearly the warnings arrived, but each was dismissed as rumor or misfiled or allowed to expire under a weight of red tape and religious immunity. By the time anyone asked the right questions, the building was already empty. In the spring of 1977, a private land survey commissioned by the Tennessee Forestry Cooperative aimed to chart parcels for future controlled burns along the outer Unaka slopes. The Elijah Mission Fellowship property, now parceled into 7 tracts and held under escrow, had remained untouched since the state's final inspection. Vegetation had overtaken most structures, and erosion had begun to unearth the lower perimeters of long-abandoned fencing. But it was not forest regrowth that disturbed the survey team. It was the discovery of the square. At first glance, it appeared to be a clearing, 40 by 40 feet, bounded not by trees but by posts. Thick wooden columns buried deep, each tipped with a rusted eye hook. Between them hung nothing, no wire, no markings, just empty fixtures, evenly spaced. The grass within the square grew differently, pale and fine as if nourished by different soil. Beneath the turf, surveyors found slabs of broken concrete, some blackened by what appeared to be fire. A nearby sapling had grown through the center of one slab, lifting its edge like a peeled scab. In the center of the space sat a single chair, partially buried, with its legs fused into the ground by vines. No records showed this structure. It was not part of any original plat maps, nor did it appear in the 1974 photographs taken during the state's closure review. The team filed a brief notation, flagged the site as non-conforming anomaly, and moved on. But a graduate researcher from Knoxville, assisting with ecological mapping, returned a week later on his own time. He brought a soil auger, a borrowed Geiger counter, and a tape recorder. The soil, when extracted, bore streaks of dark clay laced with fibrous clumps. The Geiger counter registered no abnormalities. But the tape recorder picked up something else. In playback for 7 seconds during one of the soil extractions, a thin, high-pitched hum became audible. No external noise had been present at the time. The hum did not resemble any known equipment artifact. The researcher, noting the anomaly, labeled the site Resonant Basin. His findings were ignored by the Forestry Board. The square remained undocumented in official follow-ups. The following year, a forensic archaeology class from Middle Tennessee State University received special permission to conduct a field practicum on the now deserted fellowship property. The professor in charge, Dr. Lena Worth, had no interest in the religious past of the site. Her intent was to examine construction patterns in mid-century agrarian compounds. But on the third day, students unearthed something behind the ruins of Judgment, the building with no mapped access. It began with nails, a scattering of iron brads beneath a collapsed overhang. But the spacing was strange. They followed no alignment consistent with roof trusses or furniture. When the group expanded the dig zone, they discovered shallow cavities filled with ash and metal fragments. In one, they found bone. Not a full skeleton, just fragments. A scapula fused to a strip of cloth, a child's femur. Worth halted the dig and contacted Greene County authorities. The sheriff's office sent a single deputy, accompanied by a field coroner. The deputy, who had grown up less than 15 miles away, recognized the site immediately. His report described the unearthed materials as non-threatening, likely burn remains of livestock. The field coroner disagreed, citing ossification and marrow structure, consistent with pre-adolescent human remains. The disagreement was noted in the incident file. No further forensic analysis was conducted. The site was quietly recovered and removed from the practicum list. It was not until 1981, during a separate investigation into land title fraud, that federal attention returned to the fellowship. A Tennessee district attorney reviewing property transfers found inconsistencies in the chain of ownership. Several tracts, including the one containing the clearing, had been sold to shell corporations based in Nevada, then donated back to religious non-profits that no longer existed. This circular ownership pattern suggested laundering. The investigation was reassigned to federal auditors. Among the files submitted to the auditors was a set of photographs from the original 1946 purchase documents. One image showed Reverend Earl R. Tolliver standing beside a truck loaded with furniture, smiling awkwardly in front of what appeared to be a partially constructed barn. In the background, barely visible, were a group of children standing in a trench. They wore robes. Their hands were raised. No one in the image looked toward the camera. The auditors forwarded the image to the Office of Religious Institutional Oversight, a short-lived federal body tasked with reviewing abuse patterns in faith-based communes. The office requested additional documentation, but received none. By 1983, the case was closed due to lack of prosecutable leads. The property remained uninhabited, marked only by weather-worn signage bearing the name Elijah Lot 5, Private Prayer Grounds. But the remnants endured. In 1986, two urban explorers from Johnson City, equipped with a second-hand VHS camcorder, filmed a walkthrough of the remaining structures. The footage, later digitized and preserved in a regional folklore archive, shows partial interiors. Mold-caked walls, wire cages containing empty buckets, a desk drawer filled with identical handwritten notes reading, "He takes the weight we cannot." In the final minutes of the tape, one explorer pauses at the entrance to a narrow hall and whispers, "Listen." There is no audible reply. Then, faintly, what sounds like the scraping of wood against concrete. No definitive explanation was offered for the noise. The footage ended with static, likely due to battery failure, but the hall's design, later confirmed by architectural reviews, did not appear in any known blueprints. It led to a bricked-up doorway. Behind it, whatever remained was never breached. Local rumor began to build again in the late 80s. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter the old eastern fields. Hikers found rings of scorched earth surrounded by pine cones, all arranged identically tipped down in near-perfect circles. A high school teacher collecting wildflowers reported finding a stack of hymnals buried beneath a tree stump, all waterlogged but intact. Each hymnal had the same phrase scrawled in red pencil on the inside cover, "Forgive the borrowed days." In 1991, a fire broke out in the southern quarter of the property, likely sparked by lightning. When the county sent crews to contain it, they discovered something odd. The flames stopped abruptly at a tree line, as if a firebreak had already been cut. But the firebreak was not recent. It was overgrown, yet still visible. A line of bare earth, 5 feet wide, circling a part of the forest where no structures had ever been mapped. A charred sign nearby bore the word, "Testing." Beneath it lay an overturned wheelbarrow filled with smooth stones. Federal agencies had no interest in revisiting the site. The age of accountability had passed. The records were scattered. The crimes, if there had been any, were too old to charge. Yet those who returned to the land, surveyors, wanderers, amateur historians, felt the weight of what had gone undisclosed. One local writer described the area as a memory that never formed but keeps returning. Another called it a silence that doesn't stop listening. In 1994, a final attempt was made to memorialize the site. A group of local families whose relatives had vanished between 1950 and 1970 installed a stone plaque along the gravel path leading to the former chapel. It read, "In memory of those not found, may truth give them form." Within a month, the plaque was gone. No one claimed responsibility. The hole left behind filled with rainwater, then moss. The fellowship's horror was not in a singular act, but in the ritualized dismantling of identity over years. A vanishing not by violence alone, but by careful, calculated erasure. By the time the world looked back, there was little left to hold. Only symbols, fragments, patterns in the dirt. The fall of 1998 brought an unusual discovery during excavation work for a fiber optic line slated to pass through former fellowship territory. Contractors from a regional telecom firm were trenching near the northwestern boundary of what had once been Parcel 3B, a low-lying area known for its poor drainage and dense underbrush. Midway through the third dig, their backhoe struck resistance. What they believed at first to be buried construction debris revealed itself to be a rusted steel grate, rectangular and bolted to a concrete frame that extended at least 6 feet below the surface. The site supervisor halted the work and contacted the County Utilities Board. A field engineer was dispatched but could not locate any records of substructure in the area. There had been no septic lines, no shelters, no tunnels registered to the fellowship or its post-dissolution landowners. The grate was pried open manually. Beneath it, a ladder led down into darkness. At 10 feet, the air changed. The walls transitioned from poured concrete to stone. The interior narrowed. A flashlight revealed what appeared to be a corridor, no wider than 4 feet, branching into a series of alcoves, each containing a cot or platform. The air was dry and still. There were no personal items, no bedding, only the imprint of long-removed objects. A ring of bolts surrounded each cot. Along one wall, a phrase had been scratched into the plaster again and again, losing legibility with each repetition. "The good wait, the good wait." Authorities were notified. The chamber was sealed. The telecom rerouted their cable. No official report was made public. Word spread anyway. The site was visited within a week by a pair of former state investigators, both retired, but still in informal contact with archival staff. One, a woman who had reviewed educational compliance cases in the early 70s, noted that the architecture of the chamber bore similarities to institutional quiet rooms, though she had never seen them underground. The other, who had handled corrections oversight, identified the bolt rings as restraints, but neither could determine why the chamber had no ventilation or how it had evaded detection during the 1974 site closure. That same month, a former fellowship member, known in legal records as Ruth C., contacted a Tennessee journalist anonymously and described what she called the level beneath the hush. She claimed that members assigned to disciplinary silence were sometimes moved to the rooms beneath, where sound was not permitted, not even in memory. She described long nights of enforced stillness, where waking shifts were marked by the scraping of a stone across the floor above, and meals were dropped in from grates with no conversation. She said the only words allowed were from a single verse, which each person was made to recite. "Let my flesh be counted as harvest, my silence as tithe." The journalist never published her story. The recording was archived under a pseudonym and withheld from broadcast. When reached for comment 2 years later, the station claimed the material was not verified to editorial standards. Ruth C. was never located again. Her contact number disconnected. Her legal alias appeared in no other state records. Other artifacts continued to surface. In 2003, a storm felled a line of pines at the southern edge of Parcel 2C. Underneath, entangled in root systems, was a large wooden box sealed with bitumen and bound in iron. Local authorities, called by the property's then owner, opened the container and found rows of handwritten notes, each folded and marked with a date. The earliest was from 1952, the latest 1974. The writing was methodical. Each note began with a time, a number, and a phrase. We passed the trial. The bread was shared. She asked for light. He did not return. Only one note deviated from the pattern. It read, "We are not ending. We are being filed." The contents were transferred to the Greene County Historical Society, then quietly removed to an undisclosed archive. Researchers who requested access in subsequent years were denied on the basis of pending classification review. No digital copies exist. The property was sold again in 2007. That same year, a satellite image of the former Fellowship land, part of a forestry canopy analysis, revealed a geometric depression near the northeast quadrant, shaped like a triangle and bordered by cedar growth that had never been documented before. Upon ground inspection, surveyors noted an unnatural shift in soil consistency. A metal probe contacted a solid plane beneath 6 inches of loam. Digging revealed a concrete slab, unmarked but scored along the perimeter. When lifted, the cavity beneath contained no remains but several items: 3 pairs of shoes, a brass handbell with a cracked mouth, and a waterlogged book titled Order of the Plough. The book, though damaged, retained several legible entries. One described a rota of assignments: digging 3, scalding 2, scrub and tether 5, breathwork 1. Another page listed names beside times, followed by a final column labeled Resolve. In this column, the most common entry was folded. A few bore the word held. One, dated 3 weeks before the state's last failed inspection, simply read, Untethered, not recounted. The handwriting in the ledger varied. Some entries were deliberate, others erratic. There were smudges, signs of correction, and what appeared to be a child's drawing in one margin, a square with a circle inside and radiating lines. Some believed it depicted the clearing with the eye hooks, others saw a wheel. No one could be certain. By 2010, the land was overgrown again. Most new owners had no interest in its past. Trails faded. Structures sank. Trees overtook the boundaries, but local law only deepened. Hikers reported hearing metallic clicking in the underbrush. Dogs went silent along certain paths. A park ranger discovered a path of polished stones leading into the woods, each one etched with a single letter. When arranged, the letters formed a sentence: The file is not closed. Amid these fragments, a private research group began compiling an independent dossier. Comprised of archivists, former law students, and 2 ex-investigators, they gathered testimonies, photos, and unprocessed government documents. Their goal was simple: establish the count, determine whether any full accounting had ever been made of who entered and who, if anyone, truly left. By their reckoning, at least 327 individuals had entered the Elijah Mission Fellowship between 1946 and 1974. Of these, 81 were listed in incomplete census logs, 56 were mentioned in correspondence, and 73 appeared in donation or covenant registers. The remaining 117 existed only through inference, names spoken in testimonies, initials in ledgers, or roles described but never fully linked to identities. For every person who left, they found at least 2 whose status could not be verified. The phrase that repeated most across the documents was chilling in its neutrality: not returned. The horror by then had taken on a new dimension. It was not just the vanished or the buried. It was the machinery of forgetting, the systemic smoothing of records, the quiet acceptance that no resolution would be imposed by law or time. Elijah Mission was no longer just a failed commune. It had become a template for disappearance, one perfected not through force alone, but through the patient erosion of every path back. In the winter of 2017, an unmarked envelope arrived at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. Postmarked from Boone, North Carolina, it contained a single item, a photograph printed on aged matstock depicting a room with no windows and bare walls. At the center of the image sat a woman, hair shaved, wearing a coarse smock. Her hands rested on her knees. Her eyes were closed. No date, no identifying information. On the back of the photo was a sentence written in precise, looping script. "We still know her name, but we were told not to say it." The archivist who received it logged the item, flagged it for restricted review, and quietly contacted a retired investigator who had spent his final years in pursuit of the Elijah Mission's missing. When he arrived to examine the photo, he recognized the woman. She had been listed in the early Covenant rosters under the name Judith Calhoun, last documented in 1958. Her name was one of the earliest crossed out with the note, "transferred." Until that photo, no trace of her had ever resurfaced. It was not the first anonymous delivery. Since 2009, more than a dozen items had arrived at various regional archives: hymnals with redacted verses, dental charts stamped with initials that matched fellowship records, a handmade doll bearing stitched numbers in its torso seam. None of the senders were identified. Most of the items were marked with the phrase, "from the ledger." It became shorthand among archivists for material that came not from government records or public donations, but from an unknown source with direct access to what the fellowship had once sealed. Each piece carried with it an implied claim that not all had been lost, that some internal record had survived, and that someone was still choosing what the public was allowed to see. In 2020, a civil lawsuit was filed by a group of descendants whose relatives had vanished into the Elijah Mission. The suit alleged state negligence, citing ignored reports, mishandled inspections, and the failure to enforce child welfare laws. The plaintiffs presented decades of compiled evidence, correspondence, court transcripts, missing persons logs, and sworn affidavits. The state responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing the statute of limitations had long expired, and that most documentation had been lost, redacted, or legally sealed under now-defunct oversight policies. The judge presiding over the case expressed sympathy, but granted the dismissal. In his statement he wrote, "No matter how compelling the fragments, a court cannot build a case on smoke and stain alone." The plaintiffs appealed. As of this writing, no hearing has been scheduled. The physical land that once held the Elijah Mission Fellowship has changed ownership 9 times. A portion was cleared for hunting leases. Another was used briefly for logging before operations were suspended, after a worker reported hearing what he described as a deep ticking, like a breath inside a machine. No structures remain visible from satellite images, though the clearing with the eye hooks re-emerged in 2021 after a windstorm flattened the surrounding trees. A drone captured the image. The posts were still there. Some leaned. The chair was gone. When the image circulated online, it was quickly dismissed as a hoax by amateur debunkers. Yet those who had followed the story for decades recognized the dimensions, the arrangement, the soil's unnatural hue. One researcher noted that the image matched exactly a hand-drawn diagram found in the folder labeled testing orders during a brief custodial misfiling in 1993. That diagram had never been released to the public. This echo of recognition between the known and the suppressed has become the defining character of the Fellowship's legacy. Official silence paired with unofficial proof. Archives sealed while artifacts continue to arrive. Legal inaction beside undeniable human absence. In Greene County, the memory of the Fellowship endures uneasily. There is no memorial, no museum exhibit, no plaque. The courthouse holds only partial records, and the sheriff's office has redacted all internal files related to the 1974 investigation. Former deputies will not speak. One retired bailiff, when contacted in 2019, said only, "There was a decision. Not all of us agreed. But we were told it was for containment, not erasure." Among surviving family members, the passage of time has brought neither clarity nor closure. Some continue to search, maintaining digital archives, cross-referencing old photos, tracing migration patterns of those who might have escaped. Others have turned away from the pursuit entirely. A woman whose aunt vanished into the fellowship in 1953 wrote in a local newsletter, "I stopped asking when I realized the answers were designed to kill something inside you." There are those, too, who do not believe the fellowship ever truly dissolved. They speak of sightings, grey trucks with no markings parked near old boundary markers, uniformed men walking the tree lines at dusk, voices chanting from deep within the brush. These accounts are almost always unsubstantiated, often accompanied by photos too blurry to confirm or by audio too faint to distinguish. Still, they persist. In 2022, a former cartographer turned independent investigator visited the land under the pretense of conducting soil erosion analysis. He stayed for 4 days, camping near the northeast quadrant, where the cement slab and ledger book had once been found. Upon returning, he reported no physical encounters, but noted a strange recurrence of numbers. Tree growth rings repeating in intervals of 27, bird calls in sets of 3, pebbles near his. Tent each morning arranged in groups of 9. His report concluded with a single line: "Either I was meant to see the pattern, or the pattern no longer needs to hide." Whether the fellowship's influence ended with its final evacuation or continues in subtler forms is a question few are willing to entertain publicly. But what is undeniable is the legacy of absence it left behind, in the schools where records should be, in the homes where letters stopped arriving, in the mouths of survivors who still flinch at the word covenant. The horror of Elijah Mission was institutional, yes, but it was also architectural, built into its bylaws, its floor plans, its rituals. It did not require constant violence to maintain order. It required only compliance, erosion of outside links, and the gradual replacement of memory with routine. Over time, residents no longer questioned why their beds were numbered or why certain names were not spoken. They did not forget the world. They simply accepted that it would never return for them. What remains now are efforts to reconstruct, not the events alone, but the systems that allowed them. Legal scholars have begun citing the fellowship in discussions about the limits of religious exemption. Trauma researchers study its effects in survivors of long-term communal isolation, but no official curriculum includes its name. No textbooks mention the 327 who vanished. Even in academic contexts, it is often reduced to an anecdote, a footnote, a cautionary tale without citation, and yet the documents continue to arrive. Each year, another envelope, another photo, another line from the ledger, always anonymous, always on time. In early 2023, a museum intern cataloging uncategorized holdings at a regional university stumbled upon a box marked only with the number 2. It had been misfiled among Geological Survey archives and contained no accession record. Inside were audio reels, unlabeled photographs, and a binder filled with pages typed on a manual machine. Each page began with the words, "Night Call Register," followed by a date. The entries were brief, and repeated phrases occurred: holding firm, observation suspended, item compliant, repeat structure identified. The photographs, when cross-referenced with known images from the fellowship property, revealed structures not previously recorded. One resembling a low circular hut with no entry, another a tall frame built from identical planks, each carved with a notch. The last photograph in the sequence showed a pair of shoes at the edge of a wooded path. They faced away from the camera. No person was visible, only a shadow stretched unnaturally across the frame, cast from a direction inconsistent with the lighting in the rest of the image. The intern, unaware of the Elijah Mission Fellowship, forwarded the materials to her supervisor, who in turn contacted a professor familiar with missing religious collectives. The items were quietly extracted from the university system and stored in a private archive. Within a month, digital images of the pages and photographs appeared on a restricted access site dedicated to preserving unofficial records of suppressed rural institutions. A discussion thread opened. Within days, someone posted coordinates. The location matched a long-abandoned service road along the former southern boundary of the fellowship's land. It had been overgrown for decades, but satellite imagery revealed a faint path still winding between dense pine clusters. A small team of documentarians and anthropologists visited the site with body cameras and audio equipment. What they found was not a structure, but a series of wooden stakes arranged in a spiral, each with an item nailed to its tip: a spoon, a lock of hair, a piece of cloth, a child's sock, a button, all weathered, none recent. In the center of the spiral was a shallow depression in the soil, perfectly round, no more than 3 feet across. A single stone sat at the bottom. Carved into it, in shallow etching, were the words, "We will be borrowed again." The team took samples and photographs. No official entity claimed jurisdiction. The report was never submitted to any regulatory body. Instead, it was posted anonymously in the same archive that had hosted the original materials. Viewers noted the spiral's similarity to diagrams recovered from the 1975 Review of Recovered Ledgers. One commentator wrote, "It's the same pattern as the breathwork circle. They never stopped, they just moved downward." This interpretation, that some function of the fellowship continued past its physical collapse, has grown in influence among those who study institutional erasure. The idea is not of conspiracy, but of persistence. A system, once honed, does not require central control to continue. It migrates, adapts. The fellowship's structure may have failed publicly, but its internal logic, its methods of categorization, containment, and enforced forgetting were never dismantled. They were left intact, like a foundation beneath new construction. In 2024, a minor clerical review of state property transfers in Tennessee revealed a small but revealing detail. Several parcels once associated with the Elijah Mission had been reacquired, quietly, by a non-profit listed under the name Covenant Grain Limited. The organization had no website, listed no board members, and operated out of a P.O. box in Pulaski. When contacted, the Postal Service confirmed the box was still active, paid annually in cash. Researchers attempting to trace Covenant Grain's filings found a network of transactions that led to other similarly opaque entities. Each claimed religious exemption. None had clear operating statements. All shared one line in their foundational documents: devoted to order by silence, fed by the work. A phrase taken almost verbatim from the original fellowship charter. One of these entities was listed as holding rights to archival material related to harvest sanctification. When public disclosure was requested under Tennessee's open records law, the reply stated the materials were religious in nature and thus not subject to secular demand. An appeal was filed. It was denied. Attempts to bring renewed attention to the Elijah Mission case have met with familiar resistance. Journalists find their inquiries delayed. Archival requests are routed endlessly. Funding for independent investigation dries up without clear reason. Survivors, now elderly or gone, leave behind only fragments, letters in drawers, marks on doorframes, phrases carved into attic beams. The line was never broken. They counted again. My voice is not mine. One audio tape found in a flea market bin near Bristol in 2022 plays what appears to be a recitation of names, each followed by a number and a word. The tape is damaged, garbled, but every 10th name is spoken twice. One researcher believes it reflects the fellowship's system of weight verification, an internal measure to confirm labor suitability and spiritual compliance. If correct, it would be the only surviving vocal record of internal fellowship inventory procedures. The reality left behind is this: no public agency has claimed final authority over the case. No comprehensive list of victims exists. No apology has been issued. The 327 vanishings remain officially unconfirmed, a number pieced together only through secondary inference and unsanctioned accounts. And the documents, those still arriving, are never addressed, never acknowledged, only received, logged by cautious archivists and placed among the growing files of the unclaimed. Some institutions do not collapse, they disperse. This has become the core thesis of those who continue to examine the fellowship's legacy. Not that it ended, but that its structure, once established, found new soil. In other towns, other organizations, new names, but old logic. The same rituals of obfuscation, isolation, and ritualized compliance disguised as devotion. A child removed from a school without explanation. A letter intercepted before delivery. A name redacted from a public record without cause. Alone, each detail is negligible. Together, they form the pattern. The Fellowship's greatest success was not in its silence. It was in making silence a virtue. In convincing others, county clerks, pastors, neighbors, bureaucrats, that not asking was the moral choice. That privacy, not inquiry, was the path to peace, and that those inside had chosen it freely. The question now is whether we have learned to see that pattern as it emerges again. If we recognize the spiral, if we hear the counting, if we notice who isn't returning, if this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.